Hello, Professor Sapolsky.
Hello.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for joining us today. This is Kуншткамера, our type of a public interview we make together with subscribers of our popular science media Kуншт. This is Роберт Сапольскі, whom we know from his studies, his lectures, and books about biology of human behavior. A professor of neuroscience at Stanford University. Thanks again, dear Professor Sapolsky. I know it's not often that you give interviews, so we really appreciate you found some time. And also, we thought it would be useful for us to clear some things up and to think of what's happening now from a perspective of an animal world. This might help us on maybe emotional or maybe cognitive level, just to understand better why life on Earth sometimes behave in different ways, including the most aggressive ones. Tell us which were the cruelest things so primates were doing to others of the same species. I mean, not humans, like baboons maybe, or some others.
Of course, it's a question as to what's going to count as cruel and another animal, in that part of cruelty, I think, is either feeling the pleasure of doing so or the indifference of doing so. And it's impossible to know what's going on in any primate's head. But I think one of the most sort of impressive, disturbing examples of primate aggression you could find in chimpanzees. You will get males from one group that will get into a very organized coalition and go and do what is called a border patrol between their territory and that of the next group. And if they encounter a male from the next group, they will attack him. They will kill him. In one documented case now, they killed every male in a neighboring troop and took over their territory. And I think that fits some version of the UN's definition of genocide, where you were killing an individual not because of who they are, but simply because of what group they belong to. And I think that stands out as the most extreme example in other primates.
Yeah, and people in general are not happy while being compared to other animals because we're like so different. We acquired so many traits like morality, but morality looks at something abstract, relative, and adaptive, I guess. So we'd like to know what morality is in terms of biology.
Well, for one thing, one of the endless themes out there is when you look at humans versus other animals, we're exactly like every other animal out there, and we're completely different from every other animal out there in some very informative ways. The notion of morality, or at least its building blocks like empathy, it's not just in us. You see the rudimentary pieces of it in other species out there. Again, a wonderful example is chimps. You have a chimp who's sitting there and he's being a total jerk, and he challenges some high-ranking guy who he should not be going anywhere near, and he challenges him and he gets totally beaten up. In contrast, you have a chimp who is sitting there minding his own business, doing absolutely nothing, and the high-ranking male who is in a bad mood beats up on him. So in the first case, the individual asked for it. In the second case, it was completely innocent bystander. And what you see in the aftermath is other chimps in the hour afterward are much more likely to groom the chimp who was the poor innocent victim than the chimp who asked for it. They can differentiate between someone who provoked it and someone who deserved their care, their empathy, things of that sort. You will see an even cruder version of it, laboratory rodents. You take a lab rat and you test its pain threshold, which sounds like a terrible thing to do. What you do is you put the rat on a surface that's getting warmer. You're slowly increasing the temperature. And the very first second the rat picks up a paw, you take the rat off. That's the first time the heat was, and you see what the temperature was. And if the rat is around another rat who is stressed, this rat's threshold for feeling pain will become lower. It will be feeling the other rat's pain and incorporating it at its own. So we see in a rough building block kind of way, it's not just us. Obviously, in us, it is so totally different in terms of morality. The sense you can feel, hopefully, does not just extend to your own group of people who look like you and pray like you and eat like you and love like you and all of that. But no chimp on earth could make sense of the fact that we can feel heartbroken about something going on the other side of the planet, or something that's occurring to a movie character who we're watching who doesn't even exist, or you read about events 70 years ago and you feel that as well. In that regard, we are like no other species out there. I would say what the key to human morality is, it's easy to explain animals, including us, restraining their most awful, their most aggressive, their most selfish behaviors because they're going to get punished for it. What's completely unique about us is the ability to restrain our behavior, even if no one sees that we do it, even if no one will ever find out, because somewhere in there, there is a voice that says, that's not who I am. That's not who the person I'm supposed to be. And the ability to internalize this is like no other animal could make any sense of that out there. And I think that's what's most unique about human morality.
But what's the morality of an aggressor? What's the aggressor's inner voice telling him that's not me? If a person goes with gun and shoots somebody else because of even, let's say, order, where's his inner voice telling him that's not right?
What he's doing then is making a very strong distinction between who counts as an us and who counts as a them. And as a general rule, our brains process us-them differences in a fraction of a second. 10-month-old children are already doing that. It's very, very hardwired. It's very instinctual. It's very reflexive. What's not reflexive, though, is who counts as an us and who counts as a them. And that's what's changed. If you're a lab rat, what counts as an us is someone who smells like you, who genetically is similar, thus their pheromones are similar to yours. And that's how I tell the difference between a full sibling and a half sibling and an eighth cousin and a total stranger. And that's totally certain. With humans, we don't do it by odors. We're not genetically wired to know who is an us and who is a them. We have to think about it. And the second we have a species that has to think about it, you have a species that you could manipulate as to who counts as an us and who counts as a them. And under the right, horrible, aggressive circumstances, your morality is saying you could be doing something awful to this person or this group of people because they're not an us. In fact, they're so different from us, they hardly even count as human. And they represent an enormous threat. And if there has been enough propaganda, you can believe that a country 1/20th the size of you represents a threat to your own country. So you have to act aggressively.
I know you know the story about the crucified little boy, which Russian propaganda made up to dehumanize Ukrainians. And you also mentioned this kind of a pattern here in your book, but with some other examples. Such stories are created to justify aggression of one group towards another. And it's awful, of course. But my question is, can dehumanization be a useful mechanism? Can dehumanizing of the aggressor by the victim's group slightly alleviate the psychological trauma? These are not people wouldn't do this to me.
Oh, I think completely so. I'm going to have to get a piece of, here he is, to try to bribe my dog into being quiet, but he just cooperated. In terms of that, in the United States, probably the most psychologically deep fault line between us and them in this country is along racial lines, like skin color, whatever. And you get a sense of just how powerful this could be along exactly the lines that you say. You take somebody and you put them in a brain scanner, which is telling you levels of activity in different brain regions. And there's a totally interesting primate part of the brain called the fusiform cortex. What does it do? It recognizes faces, it processes faces, and that's a primate thing like no other species out there. All we primates have it, and it's totally great. And you look at a familiar face, and in a tenth of a second, your fusiform already knows if this is a familiar face. You take your average white American, put them in a brain scanner, and show them faces of people. And if you flash up the face of someone who is African American, the fusiform cortex does not activate as much as it does for a white face. It doesn't count as much. It doesn't count as an individual as much. There's another part of the brain called the anterior cingulate, and what it's about is empathy. Quite literally, a neuron in that part of the brain cannot distinguish between your pain and the pain of somebody else's who you're feeling. You take somebody's finger when they're in the brain scanner, you poke it with a needle, the anterior cingulate activates. You take that person, don't poke their finger, have them look at you poking the finger of their loved one, and the anterior cingulate activates. It's feeling their pain. And the exact same sort of punchline again, you show somebody a film clip of a needle poking into their hand, and the anterior cingulate activates. But if it's the face of someone from a different race, 75% of people, the anterior cingulate doesn't activate as much. Their pain doesn't count as much. So you see, with the right brainwashing, with the right propaganda, with the right taking advantage of humans have to think about who is an us and who is a them, you can get people to the point where thems hardly even count as human.
There's one question that is maybe a little bit tricky, but I'm really curious on how you're going to answer this. How do you understand freedom, and why do you think some groups of people fight and might even want to die for this, again, really abstract concept, and why some other groups are ready to tolerate all the absurdity their dictators do and pretend they are fine with that?
We're a species that's easily frightened, that's easily made to feel like an outsider who wants to conform to a group, that's easily made anxious, that's easily manipulated into considering some people to be more closely related to them than others. And when you look at that, okay, so here's something. You look at people, what psychologists call a personality that's oriented towards dominance hierarchies. How important do you think hierarchies are? How important is it to you that this person is higher than you, but this person is lower than you? How much comfort you take from explicit hierarchies instead of ambiguity? And you look at them and you say, well, what's their opinion in the United States about gay marriage being legal? and they'll say, oh, it's a terrible thing. It's totally disgusting. And then you say, well, what's their opinion about abortion? And they'll say, oh, abortion is just a sin against God. What's your opinion about whether the US should be sending foreign aid to Zambia? And they'll say, oh, those people are just parasites. And you go through a whole list: economics, geopolitics, religion, social aspects. And you've got to sit there and say, okay, is there some sort of common theme about why this person thinks the same way about economics and about whether the person sitting next to you, you want to shake their hand, and everything in between? So either you have to come up with an explanation as to just why it so happens that their view of economics is in the same direction as their view of sexual orientation, as their view of this, or you decide there's a common theme in there, which is they don't like novelty. They don't like people who are different from them. And that turns out to be the commonality, because you sit the person down and you say, so that's really interesting. You've got this very conservative view about foreign aid. You also have this very conservative view about giving help to homeless people in your own country. And then there's your views about abortion and gay marriage and all of that. How do they connect together? And they will spend hours spouting gibberish at you about how this also makes sense and all the pieces fit together. And it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with, whether new things in the world are exciting or if they're frightening. And what you find is people like this are frightening. A remarkable finding: you take 5-year-old children and you look at their reactions to novelty. Specifically, you put them in a room with some great toys, but their mother leaves them there, and you see, do they freak out? Do they begin crying? Do they play with the toy? Do they explore the place? All of that. Do they freak out? Do they secrete stress hormones? All of that. And you look at that in 5-year-olds, and that's a predictor of what their political opinions are going to be when they are 30 years old. The kids who at age 5 are already frightened of novelty, they're going to be the people who, at least by American standards, I'm not sure if the same terms would be used, but are conservative, that are anti-progressive, that are fascistic in their hearts there. And 5-year-olds are not sitting there already forming their opinions about theology and economics. I think what that tells you is, when you're looking at humans at their worst moments, don't look for rationality. Look for what the irrational emotions are underneath there.
Thank you, Robert. We have some questions from our audience, if you permit. There is a very relevant, I think, and interesting question from Natalia, which actually accounts for situation in Ukraine right now. So people in Ukraine are living under big pressure of stress and fear. And instead of support for ourselves, in many cases, Ukrainian people start producing a lot of pressure inside our society. You are not allowed to be happy because it's war. You are not volunteering enough, or you're not doing enough, etc. So do you have some maybe thoughts or advice and investigation on spreading aggression inside of the group under stress? So maybe some specific things about spreading the aggression inside of the group.
Well, what you find is, under some circumstances, stress on a group brings them together. In London in World War II, during the Nazi Blitz there, rates of crime in London went down to essentially zero. Everyone was in it together. In other circumstances, what pressure on a group does is bring out all of the worst subdivisions. And I think that's what the United States looked like as soon as COVID hit. For the first 2 weeks, sitting there saying, oh my God, this is totally terrible. This is frightening, but we're all in this together. What an amazing, and it took about 3 weeks to see that, no, we're not all in this together. The wealthy were already finding ways to remove themselves from everyone else. The poor were already dying at a higher rate, and the hostility between the groups. So it's very interesting under what circumstances outside stress brings people together versus making them far worse. I think a lot of what that has to do is what messages are coming from on high, what messages are coming down from leadership. When COVID hit in this country, Donald Trump turned everybody against Asian Americans because of craziness with that, and made them afraid of African Americans because for a couple of weeks it looked as if infectivity, and all that was doing was saying, take your stress, take your fear, take your anxiety, and turn it on whoever is weak right next to you, because it's your own weakness that has brought the stress on you in the first place. In terms of the neurobiology, when people are under stress, I think a fairly good summary is, with few exceptions, it brings out the worst in us. It brings out the worst cognitively. There's a part of the brain called the hippocampus. With chronic stress, a class of stress hormones completely mess up the hippocampus. What does the hippocampus do? Learning and memory. That's why a lot of stress and your cognition is not so great. And I spent 30 years of my life studying exactly what stress hormones do to neurons in the hippocampus. So that's not good. Then next to it is a part of the brain called the amygdala. What the amygdala is about is fear and anxiety and learning to become afraid of things. What does stress do? It makes the amygdala work better than it's supposed to. And suddenly you're developing anxiety disorders. Another part of the brain, stress depletes it of dopamine, this neurotransmitter, and you lose the capacity for pleasure, for anticipation. What is this? This is the linkage between chronic stress and clinical depression. Another part of the brain, the frontal cortex, what it's involved in is self-control, emotional regulation, impulse control, long-term planning. What does stress do? It kills neurons there. It causes neurons there to shrivel up and disconnect. And we even know the molecular biology of this. What's that about? Why during periods of terrible stress, we make awful decisions. We do the stupidest, most awful, disastrous things because at the time they seem brilliant. What's most interesting to me in recent years, what we've most recently found out about is during stress, the anterior cingulate doesn't work very well anymore either. Your capacity for empathy, your capacity for feeling somebody else's pain, who counts as an us, gets incredibly narrow there because the anterior cingulate doesn't work very well at that time. And, you know, if stress is messing up your memory and your long-term planning and even makes you anxious or depressed, those are terrible things. If stress neurobiologically is making you less empathic, I think we see that's probably the most important consequence.
Thank you. We have more, and we'll come back to Oksana's questions. So Marie asks, can certain traits, for instance, like honesty or maliciousness, be intrinsic to separate nations and their individuals, like being inherited as if being cunning in their blood?
Well, the surest way to see how inherited is a very shaky concept in that context. And what that also tells you is that a lot of what people think about the genetics of behavior, we think genes are way more important than they actually are. But in terms of cultural differences, national personalities, things of that sort, in the United States, we have a fantastic way of appreciating how much that's not the case, which is I live in a city in which 70 different languages are spoken. And people coming from all over the planet and coming here. And what you see is within a generation or two, they have the personalities that are typical of Americans. In other words, they're not coming genetically predisposed to be Somali or genetically predisposed to be Sicilian or whatever. These are very, very malleable, very flexible. What you see, though, is insofar as we can take on national attributes readily as we grow up. It's starting really early in life. In the first hours of your life, the culture you come from are influencing how loudly your mother sings to you, how many seconds she holds you before she puts you down. In the first minutes of life, you were being trained to be a successful member of your own culture. And some of these differences are incredibly strong. So where do these cultural differences come from? You find all sorts of interesting stuff ecologically, historically. People who live in deserts form warrior classes, and you don't want them as your neighbors because they're scary as hell. They tend to believe in monotheistic gods, and all of Earth's monotheistic religions came out of Middle Eastern deserts, all of that. You look at people in rainforests, they believe in multiple gods. They don't have warfare. They don't have organized whatever. If they're hunter-gatherers, ecology has something to do with that. But another thing, a finding that just amazes me, you look at levels of xenophobia, of hostility towards outsiders, in different cultures around the planet, and there's tremendous variation. What is one of the predictors 500 years ago? How much infectious disease was there in your culture? And if there was a lot of infectious disease, you've spent 500 years being in a culture where they say, ooh, outsiders, they bring in diseases. That's one of the predictors. It's not a big predictor, but the fact that statistically that's even a significant part of the story. 500 years ago, how much tuberculosis was there among my ancestors? And that's somewhat of a predictor as to how open and welcoming I'm going to be of refugees. It's amazing where all these different influences are coming from.
Thank you. And we have one more very interesting question, which also is very relevant to the situation right now. So I'll read it. It's from Katerina. Hi, Robert. How can you describe psychology of people who are kind of fans of serial killers, write them letters, and continually communicate with them in prison, despite their being rejected, quote unquote, by society? And can it have some correlation with people often educated who accept and support invasion and aggression? I think it's just from, to add a little bit to this question, it's very surprising to Ukrainian people how Russians are complacent with everything that's going on, with all the genocide and all the horrific deeds. So maybe you can elaborate on this one.
Well, I think that weird, crazy world of people proposing marriage to somebody the day before they're about to be executed for being a serial murderer, the amount of fan mail they get, like, I don't understand that. There's no doubt somebody out there doing their doctoral thesis trying to make sense of people like that, but that's completely bewildering to me. I think that's a very, very different thing, though, than sitting there and being able to ignore the fact of what your people are doing to innocent people on the other side of the border. Lots of it has to do with propaganda. Lots of it has to do with lies. I think your average Russian person has absolutely no idea what's going on in Ukraine. I think your average Russian person has been convinced that somehow in a country with a Jewish president, it's being run by Nazis. And here's Russia being threatened by Nazis, just like in 1940, all over again. People operate on fear. People operate on, when stressed, a desire to find someone else who is responsible for your pain and to take it out on them. I think your average Russian has no idea what's going on in terms of being told what's happening and being told why it's happening. And I think that's the heartlessness there. I mean, that's very similar to what happened in Russia, in Chechnya, some years back. It's very easy to look the other way if people you have been trained to be afraid of are supposedly doing terrible things to people just like you. And I think that's what's happening in Russia. Because an awful lot of people there, not a lot of people, but there's some people there who are taking great personal risks to be saying, this is not okay, but it's a tiny percentage.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go back to Oksana, and we have many more questions, but we'll try to combine them and do another segment of questions from our readers.
Yeah, okay. While you're moderating questions from the chat, I want to ask you one thing actually about hope, probably. In the last chapter of your book here, we can find some hope actually, not for us right now, but for humanity in general. You speak about the possibility of managing this aggression and preventing some terrible things. You called it a peaceology. What do you think will such scientists do with all these data that are described in your books and all the other data we have now? Which instruments can they implement this peace with?
Well, one thing is clear is that it's very complicated. Okay, so that's not very useful. One thing that's clear is people can change dramatically in their attitudes towards somebody else. A great neurobiological example, once again, you take somebody and you put them in a brain scanner and you're flashing up faces, and in American subjects, in 75% of white people, you flash up the face of someone whose skin is black, and the amygdala activates. The amygdala having to do, again, with fear and anxiety and aggression and all of that. The amygdala doesn't activate because you're sitting saying, whoa, there's somebody, and what's the crime rate like? And it activates in 60 to 70 thousandth of a second before you are even consciously aware of who you're looking at. Oh my God, that's the most depressing thing in the world. Now you do the experiment a little bit differently. In my city, we have a baseball team called the Giants. I've never paid the slightest attention to them. And their worst rival on the planet are in Los Angeles, a baseball team called the Dodgers. And apparently people will just give their souls for their baseball team. And now you do the experiment where you're flashing up pictures of faces, and you're either wearing a baseball cap for your home team or the hated rival, and your amygdala doesn't pay attention to skin color anymore. It's reacting in less than a tenth of a second to the stupid baseball cap. What is that showing us? For one thing, race is a pretty strange, arbitrary thing, because your average human didn't see somebody of another race until the last 5,000 years or so. 99% of human history was spent you seeing people who were probably fifth cousins. Whoa, that's totally arbitrary. Totally arbitrary. You move to a city and a year later you like their baseball team because this is part of your city, and your amygdala has already learned how to process that in less than a tenth of a second. Change is possible. The longer you wait, the harder it is, because the more convinced you are of whatever it is your fears and your anxieties have led you to believe to be true that are not necessarily true. And one of the things that's seen, psychology since the 1950s has had this notion, contact theory. Oh, if you take opposing people and you bring them together and they learn, whoa, we're more similar than we're different, and everybody can get along. And what contact theory shows you is if you do that right, that can happen, but it's really hard to do that right. And if you don't do it the right way, you'll make things even worse. And this is what happens when you force two people to come together. This is what happens in Kenya, where I have spent my 30 years doing research on and off. The area I lived live in there. The tribe is called the Maasai, and their nearest neighbors is a tribe called the Kuria. And right at their border, there are some trading posts where you go in and you buy your eggs and you buy a blanket and this is where the two groups meet. And it's like every day of the week, somebody is like trying to spear somebody else because it's right in your face. This is not an optimal circumstance for realizing that they are not all that different after all. It's incredibly difficult. But yet somehow it happens. Northern Ireland figured out how to stop having Catholics and Protestants hating each other for the last 500 years. They probably still do hate each other, but at least it's not a violent society anymore. You know, Egyptians and Israelis have figured out how to do that. You know, these things can happen. And you sit there and you realize, whoa, these are the people, my father's generation, they were trying to kill them in war. And I don't get it. I don't understand it. Yeah, change can happen, but it takes dramatic circumstances and it takes people who are willing to take enormous personal risks in doing so.
I think we have a question as a follow-up to this from Paul, because you a little bit touched on the race question. So he asks, do the face studies account for the novelty bias? I heard it might be that some people just don't see black or white people around as much as their own race, which decreases sympathy.
Great. That both shows why the finding is not very interesting and why the finding is incredibly interesting. How do you decide who counts as an us? Familiarity. By the time children, babies are 10 months old, you have somebody come into the room who looks unfamiliar to them and their heart rate increases and they begin to secrete stress hormones. So the question becomes, who's going to look different from me? And who are your parents having over for dinner? Who are your parents having leaning over and picking you up and saying, what a baby, what a beautiful, adorable baby, and all of that. And what you're already being taught by 10 months of age is us's are familiar. That's how you figure out who an us is. And if all the us's you've started seeing off in life in your first 10 months is just a predictor for years afterward, they're going to tend to be a certain skin color. They tend to be a certain religion. They are going to tend to have a certain appearance. They cover their heads. They have beards that are shaped this way or beards that are shaped that way. That's how you're learning. It's exactly the familiarity. How do we decide what we like? Our tastes, even in music and food and all of that, is what became familiar to us when we were little. And that's how we learn the basics of who is an us and who is a them.
Thank you so much for that answer. And we have more questions. There are many actually connected to the situation in Ukraine. If we can talk a little bit more about it. One of them is about Ukrainian children and war. What will be your predictions of influence on this generation? Perhaps your advice to us, parents, educators, policymakers, maybe how to help these children now to minimize this impact. That's the question from Anastasia.
Yeah, that's an incredibly difficult one. What I'm oriented to is the science of all the ways in which things are going to be terrible for your children as a result of this, because of the traumas they are experienced during this period, because of the loss, because of the lessons they are getting in helplessness and hopelessness. They have a very significantly increased likelihood of a depressive disorder when they are an adult, of an anxiety disorder, of certain types of antisocial behavior. As an adult, as a husband, they are more likely to be physically violent to their wife than if they hadn't had these traumas in childhood. All sorts of these outcomes are terrible. And what is seen now is there's even mechanisms by which their grandchildren are going to be affected as well. The grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have immune systems that work differently than other people on the average. Trauma like that is passed on. It's incredibly depressing. What that tells you is, one thing, the way your brain is being wired by experience early in life is very, very formative. But what you also find out from that literature is there's very little that goes on in our brains that cannot be changed by experience. But the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be. It is far easier to get a 20-year-old to realize that they're not actually all that different, and you kind of like hanging out with this guy, than doing it with an 80-year-old. In terms of, trying to buffer children, I think there's one finding that's very, very meaningful with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the findings, PTSD because you've gone through combat, PTSD because of an earthquake, PTSD because you've been sexually assaulted, all these different grounds by which people develop PTSD, which basically destroys your life and there's no cure for it. There's just containing it. A really interesting finding. For the same trauma that has caused the same loss, the same pain, the same injury, all of that, people are less likely to develop PTSD if it was an act of nature, if it was a hurricane, if it was an earthquake, if it was a tornado, versus if another human did that to you. And the worst predictor for PTSD is if you know the other human did that to you, knowing who you were and did that on purpose. Natural disasters have much lower rates of PTSD than when it was caused by another human's awfulness. And we saw a great example of that in the United States 20 years ago, whatever. There was a terrible hurricane that did huge amount of damage, Hurricane Katrina. It did tremendous amounts of damage in the southern part of the United States, which is where hurricanes hit. And it particularly hit the city called New Orleans. And it basically destroyed half of the city. Thousands of people died, drowned because the levees, the water dams broke. And what was disastrous about that was it wasn't caused by the hurricane. It was in the poor parts of the city where the federal government didn't bother sending buses to get people out, didn't bother reinforcing these dams. The dams in the right part, the rich part of the cities, they had no problems at all. And what you saw was astronomically higher rates of PTSD in these poor areas because they weren't done in by a hurricane. They were done in by a government that didn't care that they were poor and all of that. So obviously, the trauma that children are feeling now in Ukraine, they're not being caused by a virus. They're not being caused by an earthquake. They're not being caused by a natural disaster. They are being caused by humans who are doing this to them and doing this intentionally. And I think maybe one of the only ways to get at it is to somehow have your kids realize, this is going to seem almost offensive and crazy under the circumstances of Ukraine, but to realize that for a 20-year-old Russian soldier who's been brainwashed to think that there's nothing but Nazis crucifying children in Ukraine and that they're being sent there and they may be killed and their mothers are worried back home and all of that, on a certain level, they're victims also. Every citizen of Russia is a victim of Putin. You guys are citizens 1,000-fold more so, but they're victims as well in a country without freedom of thought and all of that. To somehow get your children to move past the notion that these are monsters, that these are villains, that these are people who are so terrible that they hardly even count as human. Somehow, if you realize that in some ways they are victims also. I mean, I always had this image in my mind growing up thinking about Nazis and concentration camps, and a lot of my family died there, all of that. And the knowledge that somewhere in there, there was a concentration camp guard who was a total sadist and all of that. And he would come home at night and Beethoven would make him cry in the same way that Beethoven makes me cry. What the hell kind of species are we where we have that in common, yet that's what that person does each day, just trying to make sense of where that came from. It came from factors over which we had very little control.
I see the follow-up question from Luba, from a journalist from our team, whose victims are Russians. And there's one comment from Oleg: maybe it's not practical, not useful for our survival to consider Russian victims as well. Yeah, so maybe you want to comment on that.
It may be a very long time before you were doing Russians any favors by trying to understand the ways in which they are victims of propaganda. But understanding that may be a good, helpful thing for yourself. Forgiveness improves the function of the immune system. It lifts a burden off of people. If you decide that this person should not be hated because they were an outcome of culture and genetics and hormones and neurobiology and all the ways in which they are a biological machine that is damaging, ridding yourself of the hatred can be a very freeing thing for yourself. The statement, I'm not forgiving you for your sake, I'm forgiving you for my sake. Or there was this famous quote, this African-American Booker T. Washington, who is one of the leaders of reconciliation and all of that. And he said, I will let no man destroy my soul by making me hate him. And it's a selfish act. Do it for yourself at the very least. People in Norway, this guy Anders Breivik, who 10 years ago, white supremacist nationalist who opened fire and killed 70 kids and all of that, people in Norway don't hate him. They think he's a clown. They think he's an unintelligent person who was easily brainwashed because of his mediocrity, and they mock his pretenses. He put himself in a uniform of his white army that he was supposed to, and the newspapers, when describing it, don't refer to it as a uniform. They refer to it as a costume. He's a stupid, manipulated guy who is playing dress up and happened to get a gun in the process. That's an amazingly different mindset than after 9/11 in the United States, when George Bush the next day said these people are evil. We are looking at human evil at its worst. Something about it, don't forgive people for their sake, forgive people for your sake, which obviously is incredibly easy for me to go on talking about, sitting here in California having a fine life, and it's crazy and offensive to say it to people in Ukraine. But in some way, that's the pathway that people come out the other end.
Sorry, I want another one. I guess, I know we are out of time, but there's great two questions actually from Vitalina and Markian, who they're connected with propaganda. If you have, Robert, another minute, and we can address that one as well. So there are two. I'll try to combine them in one. So the first one, I remember your research on the correlation between OECD and religion. Do you know if there are any correlation between believing in propaganda and any existing psychological illness? And the second one, and if you can answer both of them. So some people can differ truth and lie, and thus propaganda, but not many. What is more important, the quality of propaganda or neurobiology of individuals or some group? So basically, the questions both consider propaganda and its influence.
Yeah, wonderful questions. I would say, insofar as we define propaganda as a willingness to derive hatred because you were not willing to think critically, to say, hold on a second, is this true? That sort of thing. I think what you see, wonderful psychology experiments, how readily you believe in propaganda, classic studies. You put somebody in a room and you show them 3 lines, and one of them is a lot longer than the other, and you say, which is the longest one? Obviously this one. And amazing, famous research starting in the 1950s, you sit a person in the room there with 10 other people, all of them who say, no, this one's the longest one, this one's the longest line. And there's a whole neurobiology as to which people, after a while, will say, I don't know how I made that mistake. I guess this one is the longest. They go along with a version of propaganda. They are the ones who are most easily made anxious. They're the ones who are most disturbed by circumstances of ambiguity. Those are the sort of predictors. And those are the people who any good propagandist knows intuitively, those are the people to prey on, because those are the people who are angry and have been treated poorly. And what you need to do is make them think that that's because of them rather than because of the people who are making the propaganda. That's a very consistent historical message.
Thank you so much. And I know that Anna asked this question several times, so she really, really would like you to answer it, if you can, very shortly. What is the best way to behave in a street fight? So,
I don't know. I'm a professor, which means I don't actually do anything. I sit and I talk about it. If I were in a street fight, I would crumble in about 2 seconds. I'm not athletic. All of that. I have not had a fight with someone since I was about 10 years old, and that one was a disaster. I can't give any good advice from that. And I've even been watching baboons fight each other for 30 years, and I've learned nothing from that. I'm very bad with giving advice about that.
Thank you so much. I must say that this comment, the one about forgiving Russians, received many comments, and understandably from our readers. So I'll read just a few for you to understand. I don't hate most of Russians. I think they are ugly. Are victims, etc., victims of Moscow's ethnocide. So the Olga wrote that we can't discuss philosophical issues when we are in real danger. And we should hate in order to fight and to survive, Kirill commented. So yeah, and Oleg commented that I want to hate. I guess for now, in Ukraine, seeing all those atrocities and how Ukrainians are being exterminated, it's very foreign to us to think of some kind of forgiveness. It's just, I guess, it's natural and it's human to hate in the situation. So that's what I want you to know.
Well, again, I use the word offensive. It's offensive for me to be talking about crap like forgiveness to a bunch of people in Ukraine right now. Yeah, don't forgive the Russians right now. Just put your energies into making sure you're safe, making sure your children are safe. And if it requires viewing them as monsters for you to be able to do what's needed to get through this period, maybe forgiveness will be what you do 50 years from now. It's sickening for me to sit here and seriously say things like you should be forgiving Russians right now. You see different mechanisms for it, and a cultural thing that I find fascinating. Over the last 5 years, there were 2 massacres in the United States where a neo-Nazi with a gun went into a place of worship and killed a bunch of people. In one case, it was this white neo-Nazi went into a black church and gunned down 9 people while they were praying. In another case, it was a neo-Nazi going into a synagogue and gunning down a bunch of people. And in the aftermath, everyone was amazed. 2 days later, some of the victims' families in that black church were forgiving him and praying for his soul and all of that. That was a cultural accommodation. 2 days later, one of the survivors in the synagogue who was being interviewed about it said, "What can I say? From everything I've heard, he's not very smart. It was easy to manipulate him." Like, one culture's means of getting through this is, I will pray for your soul because you still have a soul. Another culture's is, he's not very smart. Who can blame him? He was just manipulated. Different cultures have to come up with different means of dealing with their traumas. Right now, forgiveness is not on the top of the list of what you should be valuing. It's just doing whatever you need to, you and your loved ones, to be as most physically and psychologically safe as you can be, because it's a nightmare what you all are going through.
Thank you, Robert, for everything. And our commentaries about forgiveness might be very rough, but I think one of the most important reasons for this, if we don't see a reason to forgive, if we don't see the opposite side being sorry. So it's like it's irrelevant for us now to give this. But what I want to ask you right now is, could you please choose, maybe you have some questions you remembered, and you can pick up something that you really liked. And also, I'll ask Kyrylo and Luba to help me with it, because as I told you at the beginning, we have 3 books of yours translated in Ukrainian, and we want to make gifts for our audience here. So maybe if you remember one question or 2 or 3, if you can remember all the 3 questions, it would be like the best.
Well, I think a very good one is, I think, what basically came in the last few minutes, which was a question of, are you crazy? You're talking about forgiving Russians? That's a good question, because for me to say that borders on the crazy. But in terms of the question that made me feel the most helpless, it was the question of what can we be doing for our children to try to protect them from what the rest of their lives are going to be like because of this. You know, that was a great question, because that's a real painful one. The scars from what has been done to Ukraine are going to be there 3 generations from now, and that's very, very difficult. You know, I'm sitting here again, 6,000 miles away. It's incredibly easy. For what it's worth, my father came from Moscow in 1919, and my mother came from Kiev. And seeing this, you know, both of them would just be heartbroken, as are lots of us here.
Thank you so much for your time and for, once again, we know that you don't do this often, but we appreciate very much you to make an exception for our Ukrainian popular science media. And you see how many our readers were just incredibly happy to get a chance to talk to you, to ask you a question. So thanks so much for your time.
And also, sorry. Yeah, we know that you're 6,000 miles away, so we are aware of it, and we understand that you cannot give us like the, I don't know, we are not here to ask you about our national idea or whatever. We are aware of those things. We really wanted to know what all the fields of biology that you're into, and I feel like you grab all of them. That's what we actually wanted to ask. And for those guys who asked questions, I'm gonna ask you I'm gonna send you my email to contact me for this book. I just want to let Robert free, and then I'll talk to the others. And so, Professor Sapolsky, if you have something to say to the end, please do it right now. And
well, maybe just showing how strange all of this is from my view. I don't pray, but I pray that all of you will be safe. And I don't believe there is a God, but I hope God listens to that. And if that sounds confusing, it's at least that confusing to me, but I hope all of you will be safe and well.